Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and first things first, my voice is better. It's still not 100% there yet. I still get the sneezes quite often and I still have to cough a lot, but I can talk for longer amounts of time again, which is nice because I do like talking, even though my roommate best friend left me to go on vacation, so I don't actually have anyone to talk to. But anyway, today we're going to talk about the books that I read in July. And usually, as you know, I have a mid-month check-in where around the middle of the month I tell you what I read in the first half of the month. I don't have that for July. And there's two reasons for that. The first of those was, as I said in my last video, I have been gone for most of July. I haven't been in Vienna, so I haven't had the chance to film a video updating you on what I read in the first half of the month. But that actually fit quite well because for the entirety of July I read the amount of books I usually would read in half a month. So yeah, I only read 7 books, which is fine, I guess. It's still a lot. Like, this is what I read in months that I read a lot in like 2 years ago. So it's still a lot, but it feels weird having read more than 15 books for most of the months, for all of the months actually of the year so far, and then suddenly having only read 7 books. But anyway, let's get into the books. So let's start with rereads, and I had 2 of those in July, The Alloy of Law and Shadows of Self by Brandon Sanderson. These are the first 2 books in the Wax and Wayne Quartet, which is the second era of Mistborn. So this is set in the same world as the Mistborn trilogy. However, it is set quite a few centuries later and the setting is a bit more industrial, so you kind of have this Wild West Industrial Revolution type setting. It's a flintlock fantasy, I believe it's called, so there's guns and stuff, and you have the first cars, you have trains and so on. It's a Western setting, basically. And for the plot of the first book, just to very quickly give you a summary, we're basically following Wax, who used to be a lawman out in the roughs, which basically is the Wild West of this world. However, he has to return to the capital to take up the mantle as head of his noble house because his uncle, who used to be the head before him, died. And so he has a hard time adjusting to nobility again after having lived a quite rough life as a lawman. However, then there's a series of robberies happening and, you know, he might be the one to try and find out what's going on exactly. So yeah, the second era of Mistborn is not as epic as the first era of Mistborn, so the stakes aren't quite as high. There are smaller stakes. The story is on a smaller scale all in all. The books are also quite a bit shorter than the other ones. They're like between 150 to probably 250 pages shorter, each of them. However, overall, I have to say, just rereading this, I just enjoy the characters in this one more. I mean, I think my favorite character is still in the other series. Actually, no, because Steris is probably my favorite character overall in the Mistborn world, but my feelings on the 2 series are hard to compare because I feel like even though both of these series are set in the same world, they're not really comparable because the setup of both of them is quite a bit different. However, I would definitely, even if you didn't enjoy Alloy of Law when you first picked it up, which was the case for me when I first picked it up, I would encourage you to continue on reading and also to maybe not jump into this series, this quartet, right after finishing Mistborn and expecting exactly the same story or a rehashing of Mistborn, because that's definitely not what this is. There definitely are Easter eggs that, you know, hint to the first series, but I treat this as a completely different series and not a continuation of Mistborn, because I think a lot of times people don't enjoy this as much because they treat it as a continuation of Mistborn. However, overall, I like this one better. I I like it better, especially on a reread. Because on my reread, I felt like I didn't enjoy the first era of Mistborn quite as much as I enjoyed it the first time around. However, I'm definitely enjoying this the same as I did the first time I read it. And Alloy of Law, I even enjoyed more than the first time I read it. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling, so let's move on. Next, I want to talk about The Last Days of New Paris by China Miéville. I still don't know how to pronounce his name. But this is kind of hard to describe. It's kind of alternate history, Second World War, surrealist, speculative fiction type thing. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. At least anything I can say without spoiling it. And the reason why I picked this up was this was a recommendation I got from Max Rereads, who very much loves this author and recommended this book to me. And so I thought, you know what? I'm gonna pick it up. And it's kind of hard for me to talk about this book because intellectually I can very much appreciate this book and I did enjoy it. I enjoyed a lot of elements about this book. For example, as I said, this is surrealist fiction and it very much utilizes history of surrealism, especially in art and paintings and stuff, and brings it into the story. And there's also like a whole part in notes in the back that explains a lot of the references to surrealist art. So I did really enjoy that part. However, on a personal level, I didn't really get invested or attached to the story. I was very much removed from the story. And so overall, it's a quick read. It's an easy read. I read this in 2 days. But I didn't really care what was gonna happen in the future. Like, I purely read it for the references to art history and not so much for the story itself. So I enjoyed it, but I have a lot of mixed feelings. Like, I can intellectually absolutely appreciate what the story is, but I don't think I'm gonna be thinking a lot about it, to be very frank. So there's 2 reasons why I think I personally couldn't get invested in the story. The first of those is that since this is obviously surrealist fiction, it's obviously very absurd. And I know of myself that I'm not the biggest fan of absurd fiction. It's the reason why I couldn't really get into Terry Pratchett, for example, even though I very much, once again, it's kind of a similar deal as with this book. I very much appreciate Terry Pratchett and what he does in his writing, but personally, it's just too absurd for me. And so that was one of the elements that kind of kept me from being invested in the story. And the second thing is that I am very particular about World War fiction. I have talked about this multiple times already, how, you know, I'm very critical of any stories that are set during the World War or use the World Wars as a plot device. And the reason for that is mostly because I think usually authors just use the Second World War because it's just, you know, easy to get readers emotionally invested in the stories, because we all know that the Second World War was one of the biggest tragedies of human history, especially with the Holocaust. However, as someone who lives in Austria, who lives in Vienna, who very much my whole life has been confronted with the history of the Second World War, also the First World War, a bit less though, but especially the Second World War, who has been confronted with the history of the Holocaust, who has had school excursions, going to concentration camps and work camps. For me, if I read a story that is set during the Second World War, I want it to be a story that gives the war the proper gravitas and that properly examines everything that happened during that time, or aspects of what happened during that time. And I just don't think most World War fiction does this. And with this book especially, and I don't think that that's negative about this book, I think that that's truly just up to my preferences when it comes to World War fiction. But with this book, I mean, I do think that surrealism and the world wars do have something to do with each other, but I'm not well versed enough in surrealism right now to be able to tell you how they're connected. But aside from that connection, it just didn't feel necessary to set this book during specifically the Second World War. And for me personally, and for my preferences, I just didn't feel like the war was examined enough and taken apart enough and so on. And it felt more like just a random setting rather than anything that added to the story. And like the setting could have been any war, really. But again, that might be the reason why I got that feeling, might very well be because I don't know enough about surrealism. So it's up in the air. Did want to mention that though, so yeah. That was this book. Then let's go through a few books that I just want to very quickly go through because I'm gonna have reviews of them up at some time. The first of those was The Wolverhampton Woodsman by Ava Reid. This is a high fantasy, adult high fantasy that is very much inspired by Hungarian, Eastern European and Jewish folklore. And we follow Evika, who lives in this village where all the girls have magical powers, aside from her. Also, every year or every few years, the king sends his woodsman to take away one of the girls. Now, when a girl is chosen that is needed for the future of the village, Evika is chosen to go in her stead and she has to go with the woodsman, and yeah, that's basically the gist of the story. So I did very much enjoy this. I especially enjoyed the writing. I forgot exactly, I forgot to mark the pages, but there were sometimes sentences that just had so much beauty in them and so much power in them that I found absolutely amazing. There were also some problems I had with this book, especially with the romance, but I'll talk about all of that in my review, which will hopefully be up either in August or in September. Then I have the book club pick for my book club for July, and that was Jade City by Fonda Lee. My book club is of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, and in that book club we read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or non-binary person per month. And every month around the middle of the month I put up a poll on Twitter with 4 choices, and you can choose which book you want to read for the next month. And for August we have She Who Became the Sun, which isn't a high fantasy, it's a historical fantasy, but I don't care because I want to read it. But anyway, if you want to join, all the links to the Twitter and the Discord are down below, so definitely go and check it out. Also, actually, we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary, so I'm very excited about that. But this book was the book for July. Read it for my book club. Also buddy read it with Skylar from Skylar's Bookshelf, and we had a lot of fun buddy reading it. We were very scared for certain characters, but first, what is this about? This is the first book in the Greenbone saga, and this is basically an urban high fantasy, which I haven't read before, so that was very excited. It is set in a secondary world, but it's also an urban setting, a kind of 80s style setting. It's Hong Kong inspired, the setting, but also plot-wise, there's a very big mafia storyline. So we follow our main characters who are all part of this old mafia family, and it's about maybe a gang war being on the horizon and kind of having to deal with that. So yeah, what did I think about this? Again, I won't talk about this too much because once I have read the second and then the third book, which comes out in November, I do want to do a whole series review, but I very, very much enjoyed this. I was surprised because everyone on Twitter kind of raves about Hilo or Hilo. I don't know, I say Hilo because I never say E as I because I'm German. But anyway, for me, Hilo, I didn't like him. I mean, I found him very sexy and very attractive, but as a person, kind of really didn't like him, which surprised me because everyone on Twitter constantly is so obsessed with him. However, a lot of the other characters I absolutely loved. Actually, I loved all the characters, even if I didn't like them. I found them very compelling, very interesting characters. I also found the plot very compelling and very interesting. There was just the right balance of kind of politics and then some action and then, you know, slower parts, then moving on and so on. There were some surprises in there that I did not see coming, like whatsoever, where I was like, yeah, I thought that would happen, but I thought it would happen way later, like in the series, not way later in the book, way later in the series. So yeah, but definitely love this. Cannot wait to get to the second book, but Skylar and I are currently debating whether we want to read the second book now and then have to wait for the third book, or whether we want to wait until we read the second book so we can then get to the third book right away after that. So that's the questions right now. But yeah, very much enjoyed this. 2 more books left. First, I have A Desolation Called Peace by Arcady Martin, which is the second book in the Desolation duology. And I love this so much. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars because it's so good. Like, the first book was almost there at the 5 out of 5 stars, but not quite. But this one, it's so good. It's just so good. But what is this duology about? This is a space opera, political sci-fi duology, and in the first book we follow Mahit, who is sent from her space station as an ambassador to the main capital city of this big ass empire, and she has to make sure that her space station isn't annexed by this big ass empire. And once again, I won't talk too much about this because I do want to do a full series review of this as well, because there's so many things I want to talk about. First of all, like the decolonial narratives, like, oh my god, I was so surprised when I saw that the author is white, because I did not expect that from a white author. Like Mahit's conflict about her interest in the empire's art and her non-interest in her own people's art, and her conflict with the microaggressions and kind of, you know, being in love with this big culture that is overtaking everything, and just so good. It's so good. Just everyone go and read this duology, please, because y'all need to read it. Also, don't expect like a fast-paced space opera with like a lot of pew-pew space fights, whatever you want to call them, because this is very much a political sci-fi and it's very tense a lot of the times, but not because of the action, but because of just the political machinations and the personal, interpersonal conflicts and so on. And it's very slow, but oh my god, it's so good. It's so good. And the last book I want to talk about is a book that I probably enjoyed less than I would have enjoyed if I didn't read it at the same time as A Desolation Called Peace, because A Desolation Called Peace is one of the most gorgeously written books I have ever read. And yeah, reading a YA next to that, wouldn't recommend. And the YA I'm talking about is The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna, which is the first book in the Gilded Ones series. And in this one, we're following our main character, whose name I have already forgot, Deka. Our main character, Deka, who... There's this ritual in her world where at the 15th birthday, every girl is bled to see if she bleeds red, and that means that she's pure. However, if she bleeds gold, then that means that she's seen as a demon. That, of course, happens to our main character. However, instead of being executed, she might get a second chance at life and at fighting for the Empire. So that's what this book is about. And yeah, I don't feel like I can fairly review this right now, because honestly, to me, it just felt kind of immature. Maybe that's one of the world. I mean, it is a YA on the younger side of the spectrum, I would say, but the writing style felt very clunky and immature to me. But I don't know if that is because of the book or if that is because I read A Desolation Called Peace at the same time, where every single word is just perfection. And this one just felt very reading it next to a Desolation cold piece. Gotta be honest. But yeah, can't say if it's the book or if it's the comparison. But aside from that, I did quite enjoy our main character. However, the romance was very fast and very not insta-lovey, because a few months did pass during what was this book, but we saw our main character and her love interest together like 3 times on page, exchanging like 2 sentences, and suddenly they were already like all lovey-dovey type, and I was like, show me a bit more though. Like, I mean, I'm buying it because time did pass, but not enjoying it. So yeah, but aside from that, I did enjoy it enough that I want to pick up the next book and maybe see if, you know, the writing style, I got past the writing style once I got past the first few chapters, but the first few chapters were hard to get through for me. But once again, don't know what the reason exactly was for that. Could have just been the comparison, and also could just be that I'm just, gotta be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of YA anymore. But yeah, that was it for all the books that I read in July. If you have any thoughts on any of the books that I just talked about, tell me in the comments down below, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media, as well as I said, to my book club, are all in the description box down below, so go and check those out. And with all of that said, I hope I'll see you very soon. Bye!